Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. Christianity is supposed to be a symbol of virtue, purity, and integrity. The idea of God and the Church as the moral compass of humanity is deeply ingrained in our minds. But, let's be real, sometimes God does get a little sleepy and has had to hit the snooze button a few times when it comes to choosing his representatives on earth. You see, being a pope isn't all about spiritual enlightenment. Sometimes it seems it involves power, corruption, and a little chaos, a lot of chaos. In fact, the history of the papacy has been marked by some truly shocking scandals. From turning the Vatican into a house of debauchery to hosting wild parties with prostitutes, these popes have known how to make holiness look fake. So buckle up as we explore the lives of 6 of the most notoriously evil and corrupt popes, where the line between sacred mission and scandalous misconduct was often blurred. And who knows, it may take divine intervention to save the Church from these men, or it may be too late. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Now, let's get started. Chapter 1. Pope Stephen VI, the Cadaver Synod and its consequences. The history of the papacy has seen its fair share of extraordinary events, but few rival the macabre spectacle of Pope Stephen VI's Cadaver Synod. In the annals of the Vatican, this moment stands out as an eerie testament to both the power and absurdity that could arise within the walls of the Holy See during the 9th century. The story begins in January 897, when Pope Stephen VI, faced with a bitter political rivalry and a desire to assert his authority, decided to exhume the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. This event, one of the most bizarre in papal history, would not only cause a scandal within the Church but set the stage for Stephen VI's downfall. The origins of the Cadaver Synod. To understand the full scope of the Cadaver Synod, it is crucial to know the context in which Pope Stephen VI ascended to power. Pope Formosus, a predecessor of Stephen VI, had been a controversial figure in the Church. He was pope from 891 until his death in 896, and during his reign, Formosus had been involved in several power struggles that resulted in various factions within the papacy. One of the most significant issues he faced was his election to the papacy in 891, which was heavily influenced by his political alliances. He was often seen as a pawn in the larger power games of the time. After Formosus' death, Stephen VI, who had his own political ambitions, found himself at odds with Formosus' supporters. The political climate in Rome was fraught with factionalism, as different families and interest groups fought for dominance within the Church. Stephen VI, keen to secure his position, decided to use the most bizarre and gruesome tactic possible. He would accuse Formosus posthumously of a range of crimes and annul his papacy. The trial of a corpse. In January 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered the body of Formosus to be exhumed. But this was not a simple exhumation. Stephen VI's intention was to put the deceased pope on trial. The body of Formosus was clothed in papal vestments, seated on a throne, and brought before a synod of bishops. The trial, which took place in the Lateran Palace in Rome, was nothing short of grotesque. Formosus' lifeless body was dragged into the room, propped up in a sitting position, and a deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the deceased pope. The charges against Formosus were absurd and scandalous, given that he was unable to defend himself in any way. The accusations levied against Formosus were numerous. First, he was accused of violating church law by illegally ordaining bishops. This was a serious charge, as the Pope's authority to ordain bishops was considered sacred. Stephen VI also accused Formosus of perjury, having taken an oath to remain in the papacy but allegedly breaking it for political gain. Additionally, Stephen VI claimed that Formosus had been too lenient with certain political factions and that his papacy had been marred by corruption and questionable alliances. It was clear that the charges were politically motivated, intended to discredit Formosus and erase his legacy. Stephen VI's decision to put a dead pope on trial was as much about political symbolism as it was about revenge. Formosus had been a key figure in the papal faction that had opposed Stephen's rise to power, and by holding a trial for a corpse, Stephen VI aimed to humiliate his predecessor and eliminate any lingering support for Formosus' faction. However, as bizarre as the trial was, it had far-reaching consequences that Stephen VI likely never anticipated. The humiliation of Formosus. The trial itself was an absurd performance, but its impact was devastating. The court found Formosus guilty of all charges. In one of the most grotesque acts of the trial, Stephen VI ordered the 3 fingers of Formosus' right hand to be cut off. These fingers were considered to be the symbolic gesture of the Pope's papal authority, and mutilating them served to strip Formosus of his claim to the papacy. The body was then thrown into the streets, paraded before the public, and ultimately tossed into the Tiber River, where it was left to rot. This was a humiliating and deeply disrespectful act, not only towards a former pope, but towards the entire institution of the papacy. What makes the Cadaver Synod even more shocking is the fact that this event was not merely an act of revenge. It was part of a broader power struggle within the Church. Stephen VI's political rivals were quick to seize upon the trial as evidence of the excesses and corruption of his papacy. The sheer audacity of putting a dead man on trial for crimes he could neither commit nor defend himself against was something that would haunt Stephen VI for the rest of his brief papacy. The political fallout. In the aftermath of the Cadaver Synod, the consequences for Pope Stephen VI were swift and brutal. The public outrage at the trial and the subsequent desecration of Formosus' body was immense. Even within the clergy, there was widespread condemnation of Stephen VI's actions. The Catholic Church, which had long been seen as the bastion of moral authority, was suddenly ridiculed and shamed by its own internal politics. Stephen VI's actions sparked an uproar in Rome, and his political enemies began to gain traction. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, a rebellion against Stephen VI began to brew. The former supporters of Formosus rallied to overturn the decision, and a faction of Roman nobles, along with disillusioned clergy, managed to remove Stephen VI from power. He was imprisoned and soon after, executed. The specifics of his death remain unclear, but some reports suggest that he was strangled to death in prison, while others claim he was hanged. Regardless of the exact cause, Stephen VI's papacy came to an ignoble end. The aftermath, restoring Formosus' reputation. In the wake of Stephen VI's execution, his successors moved quickly to undo the damage caused by the Cadaver Synod. The new pope, Pope Theodore II, immediately annulled the verdict of the trial and restored Formosus' papacy. In one of the most remarkable reversals in papal history, the Church formally restored Formosus' name and allowed his rightful place in history to be re-established. His body was exhumed once again, reburied with full honors, and his 3 severed fingers were returned to his hand, symbolizing his restored papal authority. The restoration of Formosus' reputation served as a reminder of the dangers of using the papacy for personal and political gain. The Cadaver Synod, in its absurdity and cruelty, highlighted the precariousness of the papal office and the lengths to which some would go to hold on to power. It also signaled the deep division and instability that plagued the Church during this period, as rival factions within the Vatican fought for control. Legacy and lessons. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most bizarre and chilling episodes in the history of the papacy. Pope Stephen VI's decision to exhumate and trial a dead pope is a powerful symbol of the dangers of political ambition unchecked by morality or reason. The trial was not only an attack on Formosus' legacy, but also an indictment of the political and institutional dysfunction that often plagued the Church during this period. While the events of the Cadaver Synod may seem like a grotesque relic of the past, they also serve as a reminder of the vulnerability of institutions of power. The Church, like any institution, can be manipulated by those seeking to control it, and when personal ambition trumps the integrity of the office, even the most sacred of institutions can be dragged through the mud. In the end, the Cadaver Synod did not destroy the papacy, but it did leave an indelible mark on the history of the Church. The scandal of the trial, the mutilation of Formosus' body, and the subsequent political fallout from Stephen VI's reign all serve as stark reminders that power, when used recklessly, can lead to consequences that echo through history. The Humiliation Act. The Cadaver Synod of 897, though infamous for its grotesque and surreal nature, had an equally shocking aftermath that spoke volumes about the political drama surrounding the papacy during this tumultuous period. Pope Stephen VI, following his politically motivated decision to have his predecessor Pope Formosus exhumed and tried, took his desecration even further in what became known as the Humiliation Act. This act, furthering the degradation of a dead pope, was not only an offensive act against the late pope's memory, but also a staggering reflection of the power struggles and the manipulation of religious office for personal and political gain. After the body of Formosus had been exhumed from its grave, it was dressed in full papal regalia and placed on a throne in a grotesque mockery of justice. The lifeless body was propped up and paraded through the Lateran Palace in Rome, as if a legitimate trial was being conducted. The sheer absurdity of putting a deceased pope on trial, surrounded by bishops and other clergy, reflected the chaotic state of the Church, which was grappling with internal power struggles and factionalism. The event, though an egregious violation of dignity, was seen by Stephen VI as a method of asserting control over the political forces that had opposed him, namely, the faction loyal to Pope Formosus. However, the spectacle didn't stop at just exhuming the body. Pope Stephen VI wanted to make sure that Formosus' legacy would be utterly obliterated. After the so-called trial, during which Formosus was found guilty of various charges, including perjury and violating church laws, Stephen VI ordered that the 3 fingers from the right hand of the corpse be severed. These fingers, traditionally seen as symbols of the papal office and the papacy's sacred authority, were cut off to strip Formosus of his right to hold any religious power. This act of mutilation was not only a personal vendetta, but also an attempt to undermine the sanctity of the papal office itself. The fingers were subsequently removed and displayed, a cruel and macabre token to ensure that no one could ever again associate Formosus with the papacy in any meaningful way. It was as though Stephen VI sought to erase not just the man's physical presence, but to eradicate his very essence as pope. What makes this act so astonishing is that, in the context of the Church, the Pope was meant to be infallible, above human flaws, and a representative of divine will on earth. Yet, Stephen VI's actions clearly demonstrated that, in the complex web of power struggles, the position of the Pope was no longer untouchable, nor was it above manipulation. The degradation of papal authority. The most chilling aspect of the Humiliation Act is how it symbolized the degradation of the papacy. The trial of Formosus was a political maneuver, a grotesque spectacle used to settle a power struggle between 2 factions within the Church. Stephen VI's desire to publicly humiliate a pope who had gone before him showed that the papacy, rather than being the seat of spiritual guidance, had become a battleground for influence and control. What's especially disturbing is how this episode reflected the way in which papal authority had become increasingly vulnerable to political forces. The papacy had already been subject to the influence of secular powers in the 9th and 10th centuries, but Stephen VI's actions demonstrated a deepening crisis. Here was a man, holding the highest religious office in the Catholic world, using the Church for personal gain, and reducing the office to a tool in his struggle for political survival. In fact, Pope Stephen VI's decision to carry out the Cadaver Synod was not simply an attack on Formosus personally. It was an affront to the very idea of the papacy as a sacred and divine institution. By putting the body of Formosus on trial and subjecting it to the humiliating act of mutilation, Stephen VI suggested that even a pope's sanctity could be undermined by political squabbles and human ambition. In doing so, he not only damaged the reputation of his predecessor, but also dealt a severe blow to the moral and spiritual legitimacy of the papacy as an institution. The immediate consequences. The aftermath of the Humiliation Act was swift and dramatic. As the bizarre events of the Cadaver Synod became known throughout Rome and the broader Christian world, the public's reaction was one of shock and outrage. The Church, which had once held enormous moral authority, found itself at the center of scandal. Stephen VI's decision to carry out such a grotesque act was condemned by many within the clergy, who saw it as a violation of Church teachings and principles. The political ramifications were equally severe. Rome was in the grip of a chaotic struggle for power, and Stephen VI's decision to undermine Formosus' papacy was seen as the latest chapter in a long history of papal infighting. His enemies, particularly those who had supported Formosus, seized the opportunity to rally against him. The brutality of the Cadaver Synod, along with the senselessness of trying a corpse, played right into the hands of Stephen VI's political adversaries. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI found himself increasingly isolated. The very factions that had once supported him began to turn against him. The public outcry was so severe that Stephen VI's position as Pope became untenable. His reign, built on a foundation of political manipulation and cruelty, collapsed under the weight of its own absurdities. Pope Stephen VI was eventually imprisoned, and just a few months later, he was strangled to death, though some accounts suggest he may have been hanged. In many ways, The downfall of Stephen VI was a direct result of his decision to engage in the Humiliation Act. His enemies quickly capitalized on the scandal, which turned public opinion against him. By the time Stephen VI was removed from office, the damage had already been done, both to his reputation and to the papacy itself. His actions served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of using the papacy as a tool for political retribution and the perils of trying to humiliate one's predecessors in such a public and grotesque way. The restoration of Formosus' legacy. After the fall of Stephen VI, the next pope, Pope Theodore II, quickly moved to reverse the damage caused by the Cadaver Synod. One of his first acts as pope was to annul the verdict of the synod and restore Formosus to his rightful place in church history. The body of Formosus was exhumed once again, and with full honors, it was reburied. The severed fingers of Formosus were restored to their rightful place, and his papacy was formally recognized. The Cadaver Synod was declared a nullity, and the memory of Formosus was rehabilitated. This restoration of Formosus' reputation was not just symbolic. It was a reflection of the deep political and moral lessons that the papacy had learned from the whole scandal. The idea that papal authority could be manipulated for political purposes, as Stephen VI had done, was thoroughly discredited, and the Church sought to distance itself from the abuses that had taken place. The restoration of Formosus' name served as a reminder that the papacy, even in its darkest moments, could find redemption, albeit at the cost of acknowledging the depths of its own corruption. Conclusion: the legacy of the Humiliation Act. The Cadaver Synod and the Humiliation Act left an indelible mark on the history of the papacy. Stephen VI's decision to humiliate Formosus in death was not just a moment of personal vengeance, but a symbol of the political instability that plagued the Church during this period. His actions highlighted how the papacy had become entangled in the secular politics of the time, subject to the whims and desires of those seeking power. Ultimately, the Humiliation Act proved to be a deeply damaging episode for Stephen VI and for the Church. While his political rivals succeeded in undoing the damage, the legacy of the Cadaver Synod remained, a reminder of the vulnerability of the papacy to manipulation and the deepening corruption that threatened its moral and spiritual authority. In the years that followed, the Catholic Church would struggle to regain the trust and respect of its followers, but the Cadaver Synod would forever serve as a haunting reminder of the lengths to which political ambition could degrade even the holiest of offices. Disastrous consequences. The aftermath of the Cadaver Synod, January 897, was swift, severe, and tragic. While the act of exhuming a dead pope and putting his body on trial is chilling in itself, the broader consequences of Stephen VI's actions reverberated throughout Rome, the papacy, and beyond. The trial of a corpse marked the beginning of the end for Pope Stephen VI's papacy, and its repercussions extended far beyond his reign. The event not only humiliated Pope Formosus posthumously, but also dragged the papacy itself into a quagmire of scandal, political instability, and public outrage. The erosion of the papacy's moral authority. The initial shock of the Cadaver Synod was felt throughout the Catholic Church, especially in Rome. Stephen VI's decision to put a dead man on trial was not only unprecedented, but also an act of profound disrespect to both the papacy and the Church's spiritual authority. The fact that a pope would orchestrate such a grotesque spectacle, based on politically motivated accusations and a desire to solidify his power, made it clear that the papacy was not immune to corruption, manipulation, and the lure of secular power. Papal authority was meant to be seen as sacred, representing God's will on earth. But Stephen VI's actions shattered that ideal. By reducing the papacy to a political tool used for revenge and manipulation, he undermined the moral foundation of the office. The papacy, which had once been a symbol of divine guidance, was now exposed as a playground for personal vendettas, where the very sanctity of office could be violated to serve political ambitions. The immediate consequence of this loss of moral authority was a growing distrust in the papacy. For many Romans and members of the clergy, the Cadaver Synod highlighted the dangers of allowing power to corrupt religious leadership. The Catholic Church had long been the spiritual backbone of Europe, but now, with one shocking act of desecration, the sacredness of the papacy was questioned. How could the Pope, who was supposed to be a representative of Christ on earth, sink to such a level of petty political revenge? The political fallout and Stephen VI's downfall. Stephen VI's decision to humiliate Formosus was not without political consequences. His papacy had been fraught with division and rivalry, and the Cadaver Synod further deepened these rifts. Stephen VI's enemies, including the supporters of Formosus, quickly seized upon the scandal to mobilize against him. The idea of a pope putting another pope on trial for no reason other than personal and political gain was a scandal that could not be ignored. The bizarre spectacle of the trial, with a dead man being tried for crimes he could not possibly defend himself against, was a bridge too far for many Romans and church officials. The political fallout was immediate. The Cadaver Synod not only alienated Stephen VI from his rivals, but also exposed the instability of the papacy at the time. The church was a major political power in Rome, and the pope was often seen as a political leader as much as a spiritual one. By allowing the papacy to descend into such absurdity, Stephen VI weakened the church's ability to command respect and wield influence in the broader political landscape of Europe. Rome itself, already a divided city, became even more polarized. Supporters of Formosus rallied against Stephen VI's cruelty, while his own faction faced growing challenges from within the church. Stephen VI's enemies, who had long hoped for his downfall, found an opportunity to act. A growing coalition of political opponents and disillusioned clergy began to turn against him. The public outcry in the wake of the Cadaver Synod was deafening. The scandal was simply too much to ignore, and Stephen VI found himself increasingly isolated. In the end, his political and personal enemies succeeded in removing him from office. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI was imprisoned by his rivals. His downfall was swift and brutal, a direct consequence of his involvement in one of the most grotesque acts in papal history. The Church's response and restoration of Formosus' honor. After Stephen VI's fall from power, his successors moved quickly to undo the damage caused by the Cadaver Synod. One of the first actions taken by Pope Theodore II, who succeeded Stephen VI, was to annul the verdict of the trial and restore Pope Formosus to his rightful place in history. Theodore II, recognizing the magnitude of the scandal and the damage to the papacy's reputation, acted decisively to rehabilitate Formosus' legacy. In a remarkable reversal, Formosus' papacy was restored, and his reputation was fully reinstated. Formosus' body was exhumed once again, this time with full honor. The papal vestments were returned to his corpse, and his 3 severed fingers were reattached. This restoration of Formosus was symbolic not only of the righting of a terrible wrong, but also of the Church's desire to reclaim its spiritual and moral authority. The papacy, after the chaos of Stephen VI's reign, sought to put the past behind it and restore a sense of order and respectability. By reversing Stephen VI's actions, the Church sought to reaffirm that the papacy should not be tainted by personal vendettas or political maneuvering. Formosus, despite the humiliation he had suffered at the hands of his successor, was now restored to his rightful place in history. The restoration was an important step in the effort to rebuild the Church's credibility after the Cadaver Synod. It marked the beginning of a slow recovery for the papacy, which would take decades to fully regain its moral authority. The broader consequences: political instability and the fragility of papal power. The events of the Cadaver Synod also had long-term consequences for the broader political landscape of Rome and the papacy. Stephen VI's actions were a direct reflection of the political instability that had taken hold of the papacy during this period. The Church had become a battleground for rival factions, with each pope using the papal office as a tool to further his own political ambitions. This struggle for power had led to a series of chaotic and destructive papacies, including that of Stephen VI. The Cadaver Synod was a turning point in the history of the papacy. It exposed the fragility of the papacy as an institution, and the ease with which papal authority could be undermined by political forces. The papacy, which had once been the unchallenged spiritual authority in Europe, had become vulnerable to manipulation by secular powers and internal political strife. The Cadaver Synod illustrated how the Church, despite its claims to divine authority, was not immune to the same power struggles and corruption that plagued the secular world. The political instability caused by the Cadaver Synod would have far-reaching effects on the papacy for years to come. The Church would continue to struggle with internal division and corruption, and the papacy's authority would be questioned by both political leaders and the faithful. The events of the Cadaver Synod served as a warning that the papacy could no longer be taken for granted as the moral and spiritual leader of Christendom. A legacy of scandal and reflection. The Cadaver Synod and the subsequent downfall of Stephen VI remain one of the darkest chapters in papal history. The grotesque trial of Pope Formosus and the Humiliation Act that followed were not only a personal vendetta, but also a symbol of the corruption and political instability that plagued the papacy during this time. The scandal exposed the dangers of using the papacy as a political tool, and it revealed how easily the Church could be manipulated for personal gain. In the end, the Cadaver Synod had profound consequences for both Stephen VI and the papacy. While Formosus was ultimately restored to his rightful place, the damage to the papacy's reputation could not be undone overnight. The Cadaver Synod became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing politics with religious authority, and a reminder of the fragility of institutions, even those that are supposed to represent divine power. Chapter 2. Pope John XII, A Life of Vice and Crime. A young pope with a scandalous life. The papacy of Pope John XII is one of the most infamous in the history of the Catholic Church, not because of any spiritual enlightenment or religious achievements, but because of his utter disregard for moral and ethical principles. John XII, born Octavianus, became pope at a remarkably young age, around 18 or 20, thanks to the influence of his powerful family, the Tusculum clan. His election to the papacy in 955 was a direct result of their manipulation of the Church's political machinery, not any particular devotion or piety. The young pope's rise to power may have been politically motivated, but his reign was marked by indulgence, corruption, and scandal. John XI's papacy represented a sharp contrast to the idealized image of the pope as a moral and spiritual leader. Instead, he embodied a pope who saw the papacy not as a sacred office, but as a throne for personal gratification and unrestrained pleasure. John XI's personal life was marked by excess and depravity. He was known for his wild behavior, which included frequent indulgence in drinking, gambling, and sexual orgies. His actions were so extreme that they earned him a reputation as a hedonist with little regard for his religious duties. Not only did he engage in these vices himself, but he also reportedly encouraged others to partake in them. John XI's time in office was seen as a time when the Vatican was less a center of piety and more a den of iniquity. The most notable aspect of John XI's papacy was the way he used his power to satisfy his own desires, which was in stark contrast to the expected conduct of a pope. It is said that he used the papal treasury to fund his lavish lifestyle, hosting extravagant feasts and giving in to his every whim, regardless of the ethical implications of such indulgences. This shocking behavior led many to question the sanctity of the papal office during his reign. John XI's youth, coupled with the overwhelming power of his family, created a pope who was not only inexperienced, but also deeply susceptible to the temptations of power. His papacy quickly became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Church during the time, as it was marred by corruption, greed, and immorality. His reign was not about spiritual guidance or serving the faithful, but about leveraging the papacy to fulfill his personal desires and those of his family. Immoral actions. The moral decay within the papacy during John XII's reign extended beyond his personal behavior. It infiltrated the very heart of the Church itself. The Vatican, under John XII, became synonymous with debauchery. He engaged in numerous illicit relationships with women, and his affairs were not hidden from the public eye. In fact, they were so well known that John XII was often mocked for his promiscuity. Reports from contemporary sources describe John XII as engaging in sexual relations with a variety of women, including some of the most influential women in Rome. He was said to have had numerous affairs, many of which were not only scandalous but also politically damaging. One of the most famous reports about his promiscuity involved his relationship with a woman named Theodora, who was reportedly the lover of John XII, as well as her daughter, who allegedly became his mistress as well. This level of depravity reached a point where John XI's sexual escapades were no longer a secret. They became fodder for gossip, further eroding the credibility of the papacy. John XI's behavior was not confined to just women. He also committed acts that would later be seen as an assault on the very foundation of the Church's moral teachings. For example, he was accused of simony, buying and selling church offices to enrich himself and his supporters. Simony was one of the most egregious offenses in the medieval church, as it represented the commodification of sacred duties and positions. The actions of John XII were not limited to indulgence and lust. His papacy was also marked by extreme violence, political manipulation, and cruelty. John XII engaged in brutal acts of retribution against his enemies, both within and outside the church. His reign was characterized by a lack of mercy and a propensity for punishing those who opposed him in the most brutal ways possible. This violence extended not just to those who posed political threats, but to anyone who stood in the way of his desires. The extent of his cruelty painted a dark picture of the papacy, and his reign would become one of the most notorious in papal history. Perhaps the most chilling of John XI's immoral acts was his alleged invocation of Satan. According to some accounts, John XII called upon the devil himself for assistance, even going so far as to hold occult rituals in the Lateran Palace. This added yet another layer of depravity to his reign, confirming his place among the most corrupt and scandalous popes in history. An untimely death. John XI's papacy was not only marked by debauchery, greed, and violence, but also by an untimely death that only added to the scandal surrounding his life. His reign was brief and marred by political and moral chaos, and his death was as dramatic as his life. In 964, after ruling for less than a decade, Pope John XII died unexpectedly while engaged in an affair with a married woman. The story of his death is, in itself, a fitting end to his scandalous reign. According to some accounts, John XII was struck down while in bed with his mistress, allegedly by her husband. Other reports suggest that John XII suffered a stroke while in the midst of one of his notorious orgies, unable to even rise from the bed where he had been indulging in his vices. The fact that the Pope died under such circumstances was, at the time, seen as a judgment on his immoral lifestyle and his corrupt reign. In the wake of John XI's death, his reputation was left in tatters. The Church, which had been sullied by his behavior, immediately sought to distance itself from his legacy. The papacy, which had been in turmoil during his reign, was left with the task of rebuilding its credibility and moral standing in the wake of such scandal. John XI's death marked the end of a chapter in papal history that had been defined by excess, immorality, and neglect of religious duty. Pope John XI's papacy stands as a glaring example of how the papacy was not immune to the same flaws that plagued secular rulers. His reign, marked by moral decay, corruption, and violence, revealed the potential for human ambition and vice to infiltrate even the most sacred of institutions. Though he was a pope, his life and actions show how the moral authority of the Church could be easily undermined by personal desires and political ambitions. In the end, John XI's papacy left a stain on the history of the Church, one that would linger long after his death. Immoral actions. Pope John XI's reign, which began in 955, is often remembered not for spiritual guidance, but for its infamous immorality, debauchery, and ruthless pursuit of power. John XII, born Octavianus, was barely 18 years old when he ascended to the papacy. His election was primarily due to the political maneuverings of his powerful family, the Tusculum clan, who had significant influence in the Roman papacy at the time. But what he did with the papacy once in power is what cemented his place in history as one of the most scandalous figures to ever hold the title of pope. From the very beginning of his papacy, John XII proved that his primary interest was not in leading the Church, but in indulging his personal desires. His tenure marked a time when the Vatican was not a seat of spiritual power, but a place of excess, corruption, and scandal. Despite the expected role of a pope to uphold the sanctity of the office and the teachings of the Church, John XII flaunted his power and his disregard for Christian moral principles. Perhaps the most damning part of John XI's reign was his relentless indulgence in sexual vice. Reports from contemporary writers, such as the chronicler Liutprand of Cremona, paint a picture of a pope who was notorious for his promiscuity and lack of discretion. John XII was accused of having numerous affairs, some of which were with married women, including the wives of powerful Roman nobles. His sexual escapades weren't kept secret. They became a public scandal and were openly discussed throughout Rome. His liaisons with women were so well known that they even overshadowed his official duties as pope. One of the most shocking allegations against John XII was that he had affairs with both Theodora and her daughter, a scandal that further stained his papacy. His sexual indiscretions weren't just personal failings. They were seen as an affront to the Christian values that the papacy was meant to uphold. By publicly engaging in these affairs and making little effort to hide them, John XII demonstrated a complete disregard for the sacred role of the Pope. At a time when the Church was seen as a moral beacon, his actions led many to question the integrity of the papacy itself. But his immoral actions didn't stop at infidelity and lust. John XII's behavior as Pope was marked by corruption that extended far beyond his personal life. One of the most severe accusations against him was simony, the practice of selling church offices. This was one of the gravest offenses in the medieval church, as it violated the sacred principle that the office of bishop or cardinal should be earned through piety and merit, not bought and sold for political gain. John XII reportedly sold papal positions to the highest bidder, enriching himself and his allies at the expense of the church's integrity. Simony, combined with the sexual immorality that characterized his reign, created a papacy that was seen not as a holy office, but as a tool for personal and political gain. John XII's actions severely damaged the credibility of the church, making it difficult for many to take the spiritual leadership of the papacy seriously. The Vatican, once a revered institution, had become a hub of political intrigue, vice, and corruption under his leadership. Additionally, John XII's involvement in violence and brutal actions against those who opposed him further exemplified his lack of moral authority. His political enemies, particularly those within the church who dared to criticize or oppose him, faced severe repercussions. John XII's reign was marked by brutal retribution against those who stood in his way, including the execution of several of his rivals. He was notorious for using the papacy as a political tool to consolidate his own power, resorting to intimidation and violence to silence any opposition. John XI's papacy exemplified a dangerous blend of political manipulation, sexual vice, and a complete disregard for the church's core principles. His reign stands as a reminder of how the papacy, when in the wrong hands, can become a corrupt institution, driven not by faith and righteousness, but by self-interest and power. An untimely death. John XI's reign was brief, but it left a lasting stain on the papacy. His immorality, greed, and ruthlessness were enough to bring about his downfall, and his death only added to the legend of his controversial papacy. In 964, just 9 years into his papacy, John XII died in an unexpected and perhaps fitting manner. The details of John XII's death vary depending on the source, but many accounts suggest that he died while in the midst of an affair. According to some reports, he was struck down while in bed with a married woman, allegedly by her husband. Other accounts suggest that he suffered a stroke while in the midst of an orgy, a cruel and ironic end for a man whose life had been defined by indulgence and excess. Either way, the story of his death seemed to confirm the moral decay that had marked his entire papacy. His end, at the age of just 27, seemed almost like divine retribution for a life lived in vice and corruption. While some contemporary writers expressed a sense of irony at the manner of his death, the larger consequence was the immediate need for the church to recover from the scandal he had left behind. Pope John XI's death left the Vatican in a state of turmoil. His successors, including Pope Leo VIII, quickly moved to distance themselves from his legacy and attempt to restore the credibility of the papacy. John XI's name was dragged through the mud, and his reign became a cautionary tale of what happens when the papacy is held by someone who views the office as a tool for personal indulgence rather than as a sacred responsibility. In the aftermath of his death, the papacy was left with the task of restoring its moral authority and credibility, which had been so severely undermined during John XI's time. His reign had been marked by scandal after scandal, and it was difficult for the church to recover from the widespread disillusionment caused by his actions. Despite his early death, the legacy of John XII lived on in the form of the lasting damage he had done to the papacy's reputation. His actions would be remembered not for their spiritual leadership, but for their profound corruption and moral decay. John XI's papacy remains one of the most notorious in the history of the Catholic Church, a prime example of how unchecked power and indulgence can destroy even the most sacred of offices. A papacy of scandal and despair. Pope John XI's reign stands as one of the darkest periods in papal history. His papacy was characterized by rampant immorality, including sexual vice, simony, and violence. His actions as pope were not those of a spiritual leader, but of a man who saw the papacy as a means to gratify his own desires and secure his political power. His reign was a time of decadence and scandal that deeply tarnished the image of the papacy. John XI's untimely death, while not entirely surprising given his lifestyle, marked the end of a particularly chaotic and scandalous chapter in the history of the Church. His legacy, far from one of holiness or righteousness, was one of vice, violence, and corruption. His papacy remains a grim reminder of the potential for moral decay when religious power is wielded by those motivated by selfishness and indulgence. An untimely death. Pope John XII's reign as the head of the Catholic Church was marked by scandal, excess, and corruption. His brief but notorious papacy is often seen as one of the lowest points in the history of the Vatican. However, it was not just his immoral actions that left a mark. It was also the dramatic and untimely nature of his death that added to his legend. His death, while somewhat overshadowed by the chaos of his reign, is an ironic footnote to a papacy that was characterized by indulgence, sin, and power struggles. The manner in which John XII met his end seemed almost a fitting conclusion to a life spent defying both religious and moral expectations. John XI's death occurred in 964, when he was still a young man, just in his late 20s. His papacy had lasted less than a decade, but in that short time, he had managed to tarnish the papacy's reputation irreparably. The manner in which John XII died is, in itself, an event filled with dark irony, offering a fitting end to a pope whose life had been a constant pursuit of pleasure and power. According to the most widely accepted version of events, John XI's death occurred while he was in bed with a woman who was not his wife. This, in itself, was hardly surprising given his reputation for sexual promiscuity and his numerous affairs with both married women and women of high rank. What makes this particular account so striking is the suggestion that John XII was struck down by the woman's husband. This would have been a shocking and scandalous conclusion to a papacy already marred by stories of infidelity, sexual excess, and corruption. Other sources suggest a different version of events, claiming that John XII died of a stroke while in the midst of an orgy. Yet another tragic and fitting end for a man whose life had been one continuous indulgence. This account, if true, would reinforce the idea that John XII's papacy was one long series of excesses, and that he was ultimately struck down in the very midst of one of his many self-destructive behaviors. Regardless of the exact cause, the dramatic nature of his death seems almost poetic, a final punishment for a man who had so openly violated the sanctity of his office. While some contemporaries might have seen it as divine retribution, others viewed it as a natural consequence of his reckless and immoral behavior. His death, occurring in such a disgraceful and undignified manner, was a clear reflection of the life he had led and the kind of pope he had been. One who treated the papacy not as a position of spiritual leadership, but as a personal indulgence. The aftermath, political and religious consequences. The death of Pope John XII left the Church in a state of political and spiritual disarray. While his papacy had been filled with scandals, his death only heightened the chaos that surrounded the Vatican during this period. The Catholic Church, already facing numerous internal divisions, now had to contend with the fallout from the actions of one of the most scandalous popes in history. His untimely death was a dramatic punctuation mark in the story of a papacy that had been defined by vice and political manipulation. The political instability within the Church during John XI's reign was a reflection of the broader power struggles in Italy during the 10th century. The papacy had long been caught in the crossfire of secular politics, with powerful families such as the Tusculum clan using the papacy to advance their own agendas. John XI's rise to power was due in large part to the influence of his family, and his reign was marked by efforts to use the papacy as a tool for personal and political gain. However, his sudden death left a power vacuum that many sought to fill. His reign had been characterized by violent retribution against those who opposed him, and his enemies within the Church saw his death as an opportunity to regain control of the papacy. In the wake of his death, the Church sought to distance itself from the scandal of his papacy. Pope Leo VIII succeeded John XII, and one of his first acts was to formally annul many of John XI's decisions and excommunicate his supporters. One of the most immediate consequences of John XI's death was the need to restore the moral and political authority of the papacy. His reign had been so marked by excess and corruption that it was necessary for his successors to take swift action to salvage the Church's reputation. The Vatican was in disarray, and the death of John XII was a catalyst for reform within the Church. However, the damage had already been done, and it would take decades for the papacy to regain its lost credibility. The legacy of John XII, a cautionary tale. The death of Pope John XII was not just a personal tragedy. It was a pivotal moment in the history of the Catholic Church. His papacy, with its corruption and vice, had already done lasting damage to the reputation of the Church, and his death only further tarnished the papacy's image. While John XI's life and death were marked by scandal, they also served as a cautionary tale for future popes. The papacy of John XII stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for corruption within the highest echelons of the Church. His reign exposed the vulnerability of the papacy to political manipulation, as well as the ease with which the position of pope could be abused for personal gain. His behavior, marked by indulgence, greed, and violence, ultimately led to his downfall, both in life and in legacy. In the years that followed John XI's death, the Church sought to restore its dignity and moral authority. But the damage done by his reign was undeniable. John XII became a symbol of the corruption that had taken root within the papacy and the dangers of placing power in the hands of those who viewed the papacy as a vehicle for personal gratification rather than spiritual leadership. For centuries, his name was synonymous with scandal and vice, and his papacy remains a dark chapter in the history of the Catholic Church. His untimely death, whether caused by the hand of a jealous husband or a stroke during an orgy, was the final act in a drama filled with excess, cruelty, and moral decay. The lesson that can be drawn from his life and death is one of caution. Power, when left unchecked, can lead to the destruction of both the individual and the institution they represent. John XI's papacy is a warning that the abuse of power, the pursuit of personal pleasure, and the disregard for moral principles can have disastrous consequences, both for the individual and for the Church they serve. Chapter 3. Pope Benedict IX, A Life of Indulgence and Horror. Becoming Pope at a young age. Pope Benedict IX, born Theophylactus of the Tusculum family, became one of the most controversial and notorious figures in papal history. His story is one of youthful ambition, scandal, and moral depravity, as well as a reflection of the political intrigue that defined the papacy during the 11th century. Benedict IX ascended to the papacy at a very young age, around 11 or 12 years old, thanks to his powerful family, the Tusculum clan, which had significant influence over the papacy at the time. The election of Benedict IX to the papacy in 1032 was not the result of religious devotion or spiritual calling, but rather the manipulation of the papal election process by his family. At such a tender age, he was hardly equipped to take on the immense responsibilities of leading the Catholic Church. But his family saw the papacy as a means of consolidating their political power and furthering their ambitions. Benedict's early papacy was a direct reflection of the secular forces that were deeply embedded in the Church at the time, as well as the increasing control of powerful families over the highest religious office. Benedict IX's rise to power, fueled by the influence of his family, set the stage for a papacy defined by personal indulgence, scandal, and corruption. His election was a product of political maneuvering, and it was clear from the outset that the young pope was ill-prepared to lead the Church. Despite his age and lack of experience, Benedict IX quickly assumed the trappings of papal authority. However, instead of focusing on spiritual matters, he quickly became infamous for his wild behavior and abuse of power. His youth, combined with the immense wealth and power that came with the papacy, meant that Benedict IX was particularly vulnerable to the excesses of his position. As a result, his papacy became marked by an obsession with indulgence and self-gratification. He lived a life of luxury and debauchery, using the papacy not as a position of spiritual guidance, but as a means to fulfill his personal desires. Crimes and depravity. The reign of Pope Benedict IX was plagued by numerous scandals, many of which revolved around his personal life and moral conduct. His actions were so extreme and depraved that he earned the nickname, the Demon from Hell, a title that would follow him throughout history. Benedict IX's papacy is often regarded as one of the darkest in papal history, and for good reason. His personal vices and the corrupt nature of his reign contributed significantly to the Church's moral decline during this period. Benedict IX's sexual behavior was one of the most notorious aspects of his papacy. He was widely reported to have engaged in numerous immoral relationships, not just with women, but also with young boys. His sexual acts were said to be so depraved that they scandalized even those who were otherwise accustomed to the immorality of the time. He was accused of committing acts of sodomy, which further tarnished his already grim reputation. The violence and cruelty of Benedict IX were equally disturbing. He was known to have used the papacy to settle personal scores and to punish those who opposed him. He committed multiple murders, including the execution of several of his political rivals, which only deepened the growing perception that the papacy had become a den of corruption and violence. The image of the Pope as a holy and righteous figure was completely shattered during Benedict's papacy, as he was more interested in wielding power than in upholding Christian teachings. Benedict XI's lifestyle also included lavish spending and the sale of church offices, practices that were considered simony and were widely condemned in the medieval church. He sold ecclesiastical positions to the highest bidder, further undermining the sanctity and integrity of the papacy. This widespread corruption weakened the church's authority and fostered a climate of cynicism and distrust among the people. The sale of offices not only alienated the faithful, but also contributed to the moral decay that would eventually lead to reform efforts in later centuries. Benedict XI's papacy was marked by chaos and instability, both within the church and in Rome. His reign was beset by rebellion and dissent, as both secular and religious leaders sought to remove him from power. Benedict XI's inability to maintain control over the papacy and his lack of leadership qualities contributed to the unrest during his time in office. His reign was also marked by frequent expulsions from Rome. As his enemies grew in number, Benedict IX was driven out of the city on multiple occasions. His political enemies took advantage of his instability and used his vices against him to rally support for his removal. In 1044, he was temporarily forced to flee the city, and during this time, rival Pope Sylvester III was elected in his place. Benedict XI's return to the papacy in 1045 was marked by further conflict, and his political enemies continued to undermine his authority. The church, meanwhile, found itself embroiled in a series of scandals and power struggles. Benedict XI's papacy was a direct result of the political influence of powerful families, and his reign reflected the increasing secularization of the papacy. The moral authority of the church was steadily eroding, and Benedict XI's actions only further alienated the faithful. Excommunicated and living in seclusion, after his various political maneuvers, Benedict XI's papacy was finally brought to an end. In 1048, after several years of turmoil and conflict, Benedict IX was excommunicated. His expulsion from the papacy was a direct result of his many transgressions, and it marked the end of a papacy that had been defined by scandal, violence, and moral depravity. Benedict IX was forced into exile, living in seclusion for the remainder of his life. His excommunication was a fitting conclusion to a reign that had been defined by excess and corruption. Benedict IX had been a pope who viewed the papacy as a personal tool for gain rather than a position of spiritual leadership. His actions, from sexual immorality to the sale of papal offices, represented the worst aspects of the church's medieval politics. Benedict XI's papacy remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. His life is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for corruption within even the holiest of institutions. His reign, marked by violence, vice, and political manipulation, is a testament to the moral decay that had infiltrated the papacy during this period, and his legacy serves as a warning of the consequences of using religious authority for personal gain. Crimes and depravity. Pope Benedict IX was one of the most scandalous popes in the history of the Catholic Church. His papacy, which began when he was in his early teens, was marked not by spiritual leadership, but by a series of reprehensible actions that shocked both the church and the wider society. His tenure in the papacy from 1032 to 1044, with interruptions, is a dark chapter of power, corruption, and depravity, illustrating the dangerous intersection of personal vice and political ambition. The most notorious aspect of Benedict XI's reign was his personal conduct, which was far from the moral example expected of a pope. He is often described as a figure of moral decay, living a life of indulgence that contradicted the holy office he held. His papacy, rather than being focused on matters of faith, turned the Vatican into a den of vice, corruption, and scandal. One of the most damning allegations against Benedict IX was his involvement in numerous sexual scandals. Contemporary chroniclers of the time, such as the historian Liutprand of Cremona, described him as being thoroughly debauched, engaging in affairs with both women and young boys. Benedict XI's promiscuity went far beyond mere infidelity. He was accused of committing acts of sodomy, a grave offense in the eyes of the Church. He was allegedly involved in violent sexual acts that included molesting young boys, further solidifying his reputation as a figure of moral corruption and scandal. These allegations of sexual depravity were not just rumors. They were widely known and spread throughout Rome and beyond. Benedict IX's actions violated the sacred vows of celibacy expected of clergy, particularly those holding the papal office. Instead of leading by example, Benedict IX became a figurehead for indulgence and immorality, turning the Vatican into a hub of vice rather than a center of spiritual guidance. His behavior alienated both the clergy and the laypeople, as it shattered the Church's moral authority. In addition to his sexual crimes, Benedict IX's papacy was marked by his widespread corruption. Like many other popes of the time, he used his position to enrich himself and his allies. One of the most grievous forms of corruption during his reign was the sale of church offices, a practice known as simony. Benedict IX allegedly sold ecclesiastical positions to the highest bidder, enriching his family and associates while weakening the spiritual integrity of the Church. The sale of holy offices undermined the moral and doctrinal integrity of the papacy, as it made sacred duties subject to political and financial influence. It also left a bitter legacy of corruption in the Church that would be a topic of criticism and reform for centuries. Simony wasn't the only political tool Benedict IX used. His papacy was also characterized by violence and extreme cruelty toward those who dared to oppose him. He ruthlessly removed his enemies, including other clergy members who challenged his power. Benedict IX's brutality extended to anyone who posed a threat to his control, including the murder of rivals. This cruelty further tarnished his papacy, making it clear that his rule was driven by personal and political gain rather than any religious or moral convictions. The violence and corruption of Benedict IX's reign were not confined to just the Vatican, but extended throughout Rome and the surrounding areas. His enemies were often subjected to violent retribution, and many were either exiled or murdered to eliminate threats to his power. This political violence reflected the increasing secularization of the papacy during this period, where the office of pope had become just another political tool, wielded by those seeking power rather than righteousness. Benedict IX's actions were not just confined to personal indulgence and political machinations. They also demonstrated a complete disregard for the sacred nature of his office. The Pope was supposed to be a spiritual leader, setting an example of holiness and virtue for the rest of Christendom. Instead, Benedict IX's papacy represented the worst abuses of power and privilege. His behavior, including the abuse of the papal office for personal and political gain, underscored the deep moral rot within the institution at the time. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Benedict IX's papacy is the way in which he used the Church as a tool for his own ambitions. Rather than serving as a spiritual leader, he saw the papacy as a means to solidify his family's power and wealth. The Tusculum family, which had been a powerful political force in Rome, helped him secure the papacy, and Benedict IX repaid them by enriching the family with ecclesiastical appointments and positions of power within the Church. His use of the papacy for familial and political gain was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern in which the papacy had been increasingly controlled by powerful families, many of whom were more interested in secular power than in spiritual leadership. Benedict IX's reign exemplified the decline of the papacy in the early Middle Ages. As the Church became more entangled with secular politics, the ideals of the papacy were increasingly compromised by personal ambition and greed. Benedict IX, with his indulgence in vice and cruelty, was a product of this corruption. The papacy, once a beacon of religious authority, had become a political tool, subject to manipulation and exploitation by those with the power to control it. The papacy as a political tool, abuse and exploitation. Benedict IX's papacy, like those of his predecessors, illustrated how the papacy had become a political weapon in the struggle for control of Rome and Italy. The Church's political involvement during this period was a far cry from its spiritual mission. Instead of focusing on the teachings of Christ and the well-being of the faithful, popes like Benedict IX used the papacy to secure power for themselves and their families. Benedict IX's reign coincided with a period of political instability in Rome, and he took full advantage of the chaos. His papacy was marked by constant conflict, not just with external forces, but also with other factions within the Church. His family, the Tusculum clan, was deeply involved in the political turmoil of the time, and they used their influence to place him in the papacy. Once in power, Benedict IX exploited his position to reward his family members and allies, enriching them with positions of authority within the Church. This patronage system was central to his rule and contributed to the growing secularization of the papacy. Rather than serve the spiritual needs of the people, Benedict XI's actions made clear that he viewed the papacy as a means to advance his own political and personal interests. His actions set a dangerous precedent, one that would lead to the increasing involvement of the papacy in political struggles that would continue for centuries. The Church, rather than being a unifying spiritual force, had become a fragmented institution, divided by the ambitions and desires of those who controlled it. In many ways, Benedict XI's reign represented the nadir of papal corruption. His actions were not just an affront to the moral integrity of the Church. They were also a clear sign of the growing power of secular forces within the Vatican. His papacy was marked by scandal, violence, and a complete disregard for the sanctity of the office. Selling the papacy. This event, which took place in 1045, is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of the Church. Pope Benedict XI's decision to sell the papacy to his godfather, Gregory VI, for a sum of £1,500 of gold, encapsulated the extreme corruption and moral decay that had come to define his reign. This sale was not just an ordinary act of nepotism or political maneuvering. It was the commodification of the papacy itself, turning the office of pope into a mere financial transaction. The sale of the papacy was unprecedented and scandalous in every respect. The position of pope, which was supposed to be a spiritual office entrusted with the care of Christendom, had been reduced to a mere commodity. The papacy was no longer about divine authority or religious duty. Under Benedict IX, it had become a means of personal enrichment and political power. The sale represented the lowest point in the history of the papacy during this period, showing just how far the institution had fallen from its spiritual mission. The reason for Benedict IX's decision to sell the papacy was straightforward. His reign was increasingly unpopular, both within Rome and beyond. His actions had caused widespread discontent among both the clergy and the laity, as his indulgence in vice, simony, and corruption had alienated many. As his enemies gained power, Benedict IX realized that his position was increasingly untenable. Faced with mounting opposition and the realization that he could no longer hold on to the papacy, he took the extraordinary step of selling the papacy to Gregory VI, his godfather, for a large sum of money. This act of selling the papacy is seen by many historians as the ultimate symbol of Benedict XI's moral corruption. The papacy, once seen as the most sacred office in Christendom, had become a personal tool for his financial and political gain. The sale was not just a financial transaction. It was an admission that Benedict IX had lost sight of the spiritual responsibilities of the papacy and had instead turned it into a vehicle for his own self-interest. The sale of the papacy marked the ultimate debasement of the office and represented the tragic state of the Church during Benedict XI's reign. After Benedict IX sold the papacy to Gregory VI, he quickly withdrew from Rome. The sale of the papacy was an embarrassing scandal, and Benedict XI's enemies seized on this act as further proof of his unfitness for office. However, his withdrawal from Rome did not mark the end of his papacy. Benedict XI's family, the powerful Tusculum clan, was not easily willing to let go of their control over the papacy. Even though he had sold the office, Benedict IX would return to Rome in 1046 and briefly reclaim the papacy. His return marked the final chapter of his chaotic and scandalous papacy. A papacy of disorder and instability. Benedict XI's papacy was not just marked by his personal indulgence and the sale of the papacy. It was also defined by disorder, instability, and violence. Throughout his reign, Benedict IX faced numerous challenges from both political factions within Rome and rival papal claimants. His time as pope was marred by frequent power struggles, both within the Church and between secular rulers, leading to constant instability in Rome. Benedict XI's violent and oppressive rule alienated many of his supporters, and as his reign became more tenuous, rival factions within the Church began to emerge. These factions sought to undermine Benedict IX and replace him with a more favorable pope. Benedict IX was not content to let these rivals usurp his position, and he resorted to violence and coercion to maintain control. He was responsible for the deaths of political and ecclesiastical rivals, including those within the Church who opposed his rule. His reign was marked by brutality, as he ruthlessly removed anyone who posed a threat to his power, further solidifying his reputation as a violent and oppressive pope. Benedict IX's reign was also characterized by a series of forced exiles. As political and religious pressure mounted, he was driven from Rome on several occasions, each time by opposition forces that sought to replace him. His inability to maintain control of Rome further demonstrated the fragility of his papacy. Despite his return to Rome after selling the papacy to Gregory VI, Benedict IX's reign continued to be marked by instability and conflict. He was eventually driven out of Rome for good, and his papacy was effectively ended by a combination of internal dissent and external pressure from rival factions. In the wake of his departure, the Church was left in a state of disarray. The sale of the papacy to Gregory VI, combined with Benedict IX's chaotic and violent rule, left the papacy in a weakened state. The Church was deeply divided, with rival claimants to the papacy vying for control. The moral authority of the papacy had been severely compromised, and the Vatican was seen as a place of political intrigue rather than spiritual leadership. The sale of the papacy and the violence that defined Benedict IX's rule served to further erode the trust of the faithful in the leadership of the Church. The aftermath of Benedict IX's reign. Following Benedict IX's departure from Rome, the Church sought to restore order and credibility. Pope Gregory VI, the man who had purchased the papacy from Benedict IX, was unable to hold on to the position for long. His papacy was short-lived, and after his death, the papacy was once again thrown into turmoil. Benedict IX's return to Rome in 1046 was marked by further conflict, but his second stint as pope was brief, and he was soon ousted for good. The lasting legacy of Benedict IX's reign was one of corruption, violence, and scandal. The papacy, which had once been the spiritual heart of Christendom, had been reduced to a political battleground. The sale of the papacy, in particular, was a scandal that shocked both the clergy and the laity, and it underscored the deepening corruption of the Church. Benedict IX's papacy represented a time when the Church had lost its moral compass and become entangled in secular power struggles. In the years following Benedict IX's reign, the Church would begin to undergo a period of reform. The moral decay that had come to define the papacy during Benedict IX's time would eventually be addressed by figures like Pope Gregory VII, who would seek to restore the spiritual integrity of the Church. However, the damage done by Benedict IX's papacy would not easily be undone. Pope Benedict IX's papacy is a dark chapter in the history of the Catholic Church. His reign was marked by corruption, violence, sexual immorality, and a complete disregard for the sacred nature of the papacy. The sale of the papacy to Gregory VI and Benedict IX's use of the papacy for personal and political gain illustrated the depths to which the institution had fallen during this period. Benedict IX's papacy was not about spiritual leadership, but about securing wealth, power, and control. His reign is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for corruption within religious institutions. The legacy of Benedict IX is one of scandal, and his actions ultimately undermined the Church's moral authority and credibility. The sale of the papacy, combined with the violence and excesses of his rule, marked a low point for the Vatican, and his papacy serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of political ambition and personal indulgence within the highest office of the Church. Chapter 4. Pope Boniface VIII, Power and Corruption. Buying the papacy and pressuring Celestine V to resign. Pope Boniface VIII, born Benedetto Caetani, is often remembered as one of the most powerful yet controversial figures in papal history. His rise to power in the late 13th century was not a straightforward path rooted in spiritual enlightenment, but rather marked by political maneuvering, manipulation, and force. One of the most striking and unsettling elements of Boniface VIII's ascent to the papacy was his involvement in the resignation of his predecessor, Pope Celestine V, and the subsequent securing of the papal throne through dubious means. Celestine V, a hermit who had lived a simple and devout life, was elected pope in 1294 after a long and contentious election. His election was a result of his perceived holiness and deep spirituality, but it quickly became clear that he was ill-suited for the demands of the papacy. Celestine was overwhelmed by the political complexities of the role, and he struggled to manage the Church's vast and intricate affairs. His failure to exert control over the powerful factions within the Church and the broader political landscape of Italy made him vulnerable to those who had more experience in the world of politics and power. This is where Boniface VIII's political savvy came into play. Boniface, who had been a cardinal under Celestine, recognized the opportunity presented by Celestine's inability to effectively rule. Seeing a chance to advance his own ambitions, Boniface used a mix of subtle persuasion and calculated pressure to push Celestine toward resignation. While Celestine had initially been chosen because of his piety, he was not equipped to navigate the ruthless politics that surrounded the papacy. His decision to abdicate, which came after only 5 months in office, was a significant turning point in the papacy's history, and Boniface VIII wasted no time capitalizing on it. The circumstances surrounding Celestine V's resignation are still debated. Some historians suggest that Celestine was coerced into stepping down, while others argue that he did so voluntarily, disillusioned by the political and administrative burdens of the papacy. However, what is clear is that Boniface played a crucial role in facilitating the resignation. By aligning himself with the powerful political factions within the church, particularly the Roman nobility, Boniface was able to position himself as the ideal candidate for the papacy. Once Celestine resigned, Boniface VIII was elected as pope, and his ambition and ruthlessness became immediately apparent. He quickly consolidated his power within the church, but the manner in which he gained the papacy left a stain on his reputation. In the eyes of many, Boniface's actions showed that he was willing to manipulate and exploit the papacy for personal gain. He was not just interested in religious leadership. His primary aim was to secure and strengthen his political position. However, the story didn't end there. Boniface VIII's treatment of Celestine V following the resignation is perhaps the most egregious aspect of his rise to power. After Celestine's abdication, Boniface had the former pope imprisoned in a remote fortress, where Celestine lived out his final days in seclusion. Boniface's decision to imprison Celestine was both a political move and a personal act of control. By keeping the former pope out of sight and under tight control, Boniface ensured that there would be no challenge to his authority. Celestine was eventually allowed to die in prison under suspicious circumstances, and many contemporaries suspected foul play. The papacy was now firmly in Boniface VIII's hands, but the way he had secured it left a legacy of cruelty and political maneuvering. Boniface VIII's rise to power by deposing Celestine V was a reflection of the growing political involvement in the papacy during the late 13th century. Rather than being a purely spiritual office, the papacy had become a highly contested political position, subject to manipulation by powerful factions within the church and secular rulers. Boniface's actions during this period exemplify the extent to which the papacy was intertwined with the political and social dynamics of the time. His methods were not those of a pious spiritual leader, but those of a political strategist, willing to remove anyone who stood in his way. His manipulation of Celestine V's resignation and his subsequent imprisonment of the former pope set the tone for his entire papacy. Boniface VIII was not content to simply lead the church. He sought to control it, to use it as a tool for his own political ambitions. His ascent to power through the exploitation of Celestine V's weaknesses was a precursor to the power struggles and conflicts that would define much of his papacy. The political landscape of the time was one in which the Pope was not only a religious figure, but also a ruler of significant temporal power. In this world, the papacy had become a prize that was fought over by those with the ambition and resources to seize it. Boniface VIII's actions in removing Celestine V and securing the papacy for himself exemplified the ways in which the office of Pope had been reduced to a political tool, susceptible to manipulation by the powerful families and factions that controlled Rome and the wider church. In many ways, Boniface VIII's rise to power marked a turning point in the history of the papacy. His papacy would go on to be defined by his attempts to assert papal supremacy over secular rulers, particularly with the issuance of his famous Unam Sanctum Bull, which declared the Pope's authority over all earthly rulers. However, his actions in the early years of his papacy, particularly in relation to Celestine V's resignation, demonstrated that his primary concern was not spiritual leadership, but the consolidation of political power. By deposing and imprisoning a former pope, Boniface VIII set a precedent for the papacy's increasing involvement in the secular power struggles of the time. Boniface VIII's legacy is one of ambition, manipulation, and ruthlessness. His rise to the papacy by pressuring Celestine V to resign demonstrated that, for him, the papacy was not just a spiritual calling, but a means to achieve personal and political power. His treatment of Celestine V after his resignation, including his imprisonment and suspicious death, only further cemented his reputation as a pope willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. Boniface VIII's papacy, defined by his political machinations and thirst for power, would go on to shape the course of the Church's history for years to come. One of the most defining moments of Pope Boniface VIII's papacy was the issuance of the Unam Sanctum papal bull in 1302, a document that solidified his ambition to assert the supremacy of the papacy over all secular rulers. This bold declaration of papal authority was not merely a religious document, but a political maneuver that would have far-reaching consequences for the relationship between the Church and the state. In Unam Sanctum, Boniface VIII made it clear that the Pope held supreme power over both spiritual and temporal matters, including the governance of earthly rulers. The document's famous declaration, "We are informed by the text of the Gospel that the Church is one, and that the Church is supreme over every earthly power," was an explicit statement of papal dominance. Boniface's goal was to assert the Pope's authority not only over the Church but also over kings, princes, and rulers. The bull stated that it was necessary for every human being to be subject to the papacy to achieve salvation, underlining the Church's claim to ultimate authority in the world. This was a direct challenge to the growing power of monarchs, especially King Philip IV of France, who had already been in conflict with the Pope over matters of taxation and control over the clergy. Boniface VIII's belief in papal supremacy was deeply rooted in his desire to centralize power within the papacy and restore the Church to its former glory as the moral and political leader of Europe. The issuance of Unam Sanctum was not just about theological doctrine, but also about establishing papal control over the secular world, which Boniface saw as essential to his vision for the future of the Church. At the time, the papacy held enormous influence, but it was constantly threatened by the growing power of monarchs and other political entities. Boniface VIII aimed to put an end to this challenge, asserting that the Pope was not just a spiritual leader, but the ultimate earthly authority. The timing of Unam Sanctum was significant. Boniface was embroiled in a bitter conflict with King Philip IV of France, who had been taxing the French clergy to finance his wars. Philip believed he had the right to tax the clergy in his kingdom, but Boniface VIII strongly opposed this, asserting that only the Pope had the authority to regulate church matters, including the taxation of the clergy. This conflict escalated, with Philip accusing Boniface of overstepping his bounds and asserting that the French crown had the ultimate say in matters concerning the Church in France. In response, Boniface issued Unam Sanctum, directly confronting the monarch and declaring that all secular rulers were subject to the authority of the Pope. The impact of Unam Sanctum was profound. It not only angered Philip IV, but also sparked a series of political maneuvers that would ultimately lead to Boniface VIII's downfall. Philip responded by accusing the Pope of heresy and calling for a council to depose him. The king's wrath was not limited to papal decrees. He also sought to undermine the Pope's authority by accusing him of corruption and manipulation. This conflict between Boniface and Philip would become one of the most dramatic episodes in papal history, as it highlighted the tension between papal power and the rise of national monarchies. The escalation of conflict with King Philip IV. The battle between Boniface VIII and King Philip IV reached its peak in 1303 when Philip, fed up with the Pope's interference, decided to take drastic action. In response to Unam Sanctum and Boniface's continued resistance to his attempts to tax the clergy, Philip sought to break the Pope's power once and for all. Philip's response was both political and personal. He ordered the capture of Boniface VIII, marking a significant escalation in the conflict between the French monarchy and the papacy. Philip's agents, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, entered Italy and captured the Pope in the town of Anagni in September 1303. The Pope was held captive by Philip's forces, who subjected him to physical and psychological abuse. The humiliation of Boniface VIII was complete. His claim to supreme authority was effectively crushed by the actions of a secular ruler, and his papacy was shattered by this bold display of royal power. Though Boniface VIII was eventually released after a few days in captivity, the damage to his health and reputation was irreparable. The capture of Boniface VIII marked a turning point in the history of the papacy. It demonstrated that, despite his claims of papal supremacy, the Pope was not immune to the influence and power of secular rulers. The events of Anagni, in which the Pope was humiliated and imprisoned, would forever tarnish Boniface's legacy. While he had sought to strengthen the authority of the papacy, his violent confrontation with Philip IV had exposed the vulnerabilities of the papacy in the face of royal power. Boniface VIII's experience in captivity, combined with the physical and emotional toll of the confrontation with Philip IV, led to his rapid decline in health. He died shortly after his release in October 1303. His death marked the end of a papacy that had been defined by ambition, conflict, and controversy. Boniface VIII's dramatic clash with Philip IV had proved that papal authority, no matter how forcefully asserted, could be challenged by the rising power of national monarchs. His death would lead to a period of papal decline, as the Church struggled to regain its influence and moral authority in the wake of his failed attempt to establish papal supremacy. The legacy of Unam Sanctum and papal supremacy. Boniface VIII's Unam Sanctum is one of the most significant papal bulls in the history of the Catholic Church. While it was intended to assert papal supremacy over secular rulers, it ultimately exposed the tensions between papal power and the rise of national monarchies. The bull's declaration of the Pope's ultimate authority over both spiritual and temporal matters was a radical assertion that would have lasting implications for the relationship between the Church and secular rulers. The document, which proclaimed that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, left little room for debate about papal authority, but it also set the stage for the growing conflict between the Church and the state. While Unam Sanctum was a bold and ambitious declaration, it failed to achieve its goal of securing papal supremacy. The subsequent events, including the humiliation of Boniface VIII and the rise of powerful monarchs like Philip IV, illustrated that the Church's authority was increasingly under threat. The papacy would never again wield the same kind of unchecked power it had enjoyed in the medieval period. In the years that followed, the Church would face a series of challenges to its authority, culminating in the Avignon papacy, when the papacy would be moved to France and the Pope would be subject to the influence of the French crown. Despite its failure to secure papal supremacy, Unam Sanctum remains a symbol of Boniface VIII's ambitions and the lengths to which he was willing to go to assert papal authority. The bull's impact on the relationship between the Church and secular rulers would echo for centuries, shaping the course of Church history and setting the stage for the eventual rise of powerful monarchies that would challenge the Church's traditional dominance. Pope Boniface VIII's papacy was defined by his aggressive attempts to centralize power within the papacy and to assert the Church's supremacy over secular rulers. His issuance of Unam Sanctum in 1302 represented the peak of his ambitions, but it also marked the beginning of his downfall. The confrontation with King Philip IV and the subsequent capture of Boniface VIII showed that even the Pope, despite his claims of divine authority, was not immune to the growing power of secular monarchs. Boniface's legacy, defined by conflict, ambition, and ultimate failure, serves as a reminder of the complex and often contentious relationship between the papacy and the state in medieval Europe. His dramatic end. Pope Boniface VIII's papacy, one of the most ambitious in medieval Church history, ended in dramatic and humiliating fashion. His assertion of papal supremacy through measures like the Unam Sanctum papal bull, which claimed the Pope's authority over all secular rulers, ignited a fierce confrontation with King Philip IV of France. This conflict, rooted in both political and spiritual struggles, ultimately led to Boniface's capture, humiliation, and death, an event that permanently altered the relationship between the Church and secular powers. Boniface VIII's efforts to assert papal supremacy were marked by sharp confrontations with political rulers, particularly Philip IV. The French king, frustrated by Boniface's refusal to allow him to tax the clergy, saw the papacy as an obstacle to his political and economic ambitions. This led to a bitter feud between the two men, with Boniface issuing declarations against Philip's interference in church matters and declaring that the Pope's authority was superior to any secular ruler. The Unam Sanctum bull, issued in 1302, was the pinnacle of this conflict, boldly asserting that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Boniface VIII's claim was that the Pope held supreme authority over both spiritual and temporal matters, directly challenging the growing power of monarchs like Philip. In response to Boniface's claims, Philip, who had already sought to undermine papal authority, retaliated with force. The king called for a council to depose the Pope, accusing him of corruption, simony, and other offenses. Tensions between the two men escalated, leading to Philip's decision to take more direct action. In 1303, Philip sent agents to Italy, where they captured Boniface VIII in the town of Anagni, just outside Rome. The Pope was taken prisoner by Philip's men, and the events that followed would shake the papacy to its core. Boniface's capture was a profound humiliation for the Church. The Pope, who had once declared the papacy's superiority over all secular rulers, was now held captive by one of those very rulers. His treatment was brutal. He was publicly disgraced, and many contemporary accounts suggest that he was subjected to physical abuse. The humiliation was not just personal, it was political, as it demonstrated that the Pope, despite his claims of divine authority, could be overpowered and imprisoned by a secular king. Boniface VIII's capture was also a reflection of the power dynamics between church and state during the medieval period. The fact that Philip IV was able to take such drastic action against the Pope signaled a shift in the balance of power between the two institutions. For centuries, the papacy had been the most powerful institution in Europe, with immense spiritual and temporal influence. However, by the early 14th century, the growing power of monarchs like Philip IV had begun to challenge the papacy's traditional dominance. The dramatic capture of Boniface VIII came after a series of escalating hostilities between the Pope and the French king. Their conflict had been brewing for years, and the Pope's refusal to yield to Philip's demands regarding the taxation of clergy was the final straw. Philip, who had already become deeply entrenched in his efforts to consolidate royal power, took advantage of the Pope's weakness to break the papacy's influence in France. Boniface, whose earlier actions had earned him both admiration and fear, now found himself exposed as vulnerable, a stark contrast to the towering authority he had once claimed. The Pope was held prisoner for several days, enduring a combination of humiliation, verbal abuse, and psychological torment. The exact details of his imprisonment remain somewhat unclear, but it is generally believed that Boniface's health deteriorated rapidly as a result of the ordeal. His captors, seemingly aware of the devastating effect the incident had on Boniface's physical and mental state, eventually released him. However, the damage had already been done. The humiliation he experienced in Anagni would leave an indelible mark on his health and legacy. The papacy's decline and Boniface's death. After his release, Boniface VIII returned to Rome, but he was a broken man. His health, both physical and mental, had suffered significantly during his time in captivity. Boniface's capture, which had stripped him of his dignity and exposed the Pope's vulnerability, marked the end of his papacy's dominance in European politics. The reverence for the papacy, which had been so ingrained in the medieval worldview, was shattered. Boniface VIII's dramatic capture and the subsequent loss of papal authority led to a period of decline for the Church, and his papacy would become a symbol of the political perils of unchecked ambition. Boniface VIII's death in October 1303 came shortly after his return to Rome. While the precise cause of his death is not known, many historians believe that the emotional and physical toll of his capture played a significant role. His sudden demise left the papacy in a state of turmoil, as the Church struggled to recover from the scandal of the Pope's imprisonment and the power struggle with the French monarchy. Boniface's death also marked the end of the era of strong papal authority, as the influence of monarchs like Philip IV continued to rise. The Pope's passing was followed by a period of instability within the Church. Boniface's successor, Pope Benedict XI, was elected, but his papacy was brief and marked by continued tensions between the papacy and the French crown. The following years saw the papacy weaken further, culminating in the move of the papacy to Avignon in 1309, where the Pope would be under the influence of the French monarchy for the next 70 years. This period, known as the Avignon Papacy, marked the Church's shift from Rome to France, a dramatic change that was largely a result of the power struggles that Boniface VIII's papacy had ignited. Legacy of Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII's legacy is complex and fraught with contradictions. On one hand, he was a pope who sought to assert the primacy of the Church and the papacy over all secular powers. Through documents like Unam Sanctum, Boniface boldly declared the supremacy of the Pope in both spiritual and temporal matters, pushing the papacy to its greatest heights of influence. On the other hand, his papacy was marked by controversy, conflict, and ultimately, a dramatic fall from power. His ambitious attempts to reassert papal supremacy ultimately led to his downfall. The brutal confrontation with Philip IV of France, culminating in Boniface's capture, highlighted the vulnerability of the papacy in the face of powerful secular monarchs. The inability of the Pope to maintain control over the rising power of kings signaled the beginning of a new era in church-state relations, one in which the authority of the Pope would be challenged by the growing might of European monarchies. Boniface's death, while it ended a particularly tumultuous papacy, did not bring immediate stability to the Church. Instead, it marked the beginning of a period of uncertainty, during which the papacy would struggle to regain its authority. The move to Avignon and the decline of the papacy's influence in Rome were direct consequences of the power struggles that Boniface VIII's reign had precipitated. Chapter 5, Pope Urban VI, Temper and Violence. Opposition to simony but violent temper. Pope Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Prignano, ascended to the papacy in 1378 in the aftermath of the death of Pope Gregory XI, marking the beginning of one of the most tumultuous periods in papal history. His papacy, however, was not defined by his efforts at reform or spiritual guidance, but rather by his explosive temper and the violent measures he took to secure and maintain his authority. Urban's reign is often remembered for the tragic schism it caused within the Catholic Church. But more than that, it is marked by his volatile personality and his tendency to rule with intimidation and fear, especially towards his enemies inside the Church. Urban VI was a pope who initially gained some respect for his stance against simony, the practice of buying and selling ecclesiastical offices, which was one of the most despised corrupt practices within the medieval Church. At the time of his election, Urban was seen as a man who could restore integrity to the papacy, particularly after the long exile of the papacy to Avignon and the return of the papacy to Rome in 1377. Urban was keen on addressing the corruption within the Church, and his early papacy showed a commitment to stamping out the sale of church offices and ensuring that ecclesiastical appointments were made based on merit rather than wealth. However, his opposition to simony, though noble, was often overshadowed by his excessive temper and his authoritarian approach to leadership. From the very beginning of his papacy, Urban VI's personality became a significant point of contention. His harshness and overbearing nature quickly alienated many of the cardinals who had supported his election. He soon displayed a propensity for violent outbursts, both verbal and physical, against those who opposed him or even disagreed with him. Urban VI's temper was notoriously unpredictable, and those around him often found themselves on the receiving end of his wrath. His violent reactions to perceived slights or challenges to his authority were seen as excessive and, in many cases, politically damaging. The tension between Urban VI's desire to reform the Church and his inability to manage his volatile personality created a deep divide within the Church. While his opposition to simony was in line with the moral expectations of the office, his frequent outbursts against both clergy and political rivals created an environment of fear and instability. He became infamous for throwing tantrums and berating his fellow cardinals, some of whom were his initial supporters. In an environment that demanded diplomacy and measured responses, Urban VI's temperament made him a polarizing figure, unable to win the loyalty of his closest allies. Urban's violent temper was not limited to just verbal assaults. According to several historical accounts, he resorted to physical violence against those he believed were acting against his wishes. There were reports of him physically attacking his cardinals and other church officials. His erratic behavior soon became a major concern among the Roman clergy, who began to see him not as a religious leader, but as an unfit ruler who was damaging the reputation of the papacy. His failure to control his impulses and act rationally in times of conflict undermined his papacy and sowed the seeds for division within the Church. As the months passed, the tension surrounding Urban VI's papacy continued to grow. His rule, marked by personal vendettas and a disregard for diplomacy, set the stage for what would become the Western Schism, the split within the Church that would last for nearly 40 years. Urban VI's violent temper and inability to compromise made him incapable of leading a unified Church. Instead of restoring peace and harmony within the papacy, his actions created a toxic environment, alienating many of his fellow clergy and leading to a dramatic confrontation with his political and spiritual opponents. The Western Schism and the election of Clement VII. The climax of Urban VI's papacy came with the emergence of a rival pope, Clement VII, who was elected by a group of French cardinals in opposition to Urban's reign. The tensions between Urban VI and the French cardinals had been simmering for months, and Urban's treatment of those who disagreed with him, especially the French cardinals, exacerbated the conflict. These cardinals, upset by his authoritarian rule and fearful of his violent tendencies, decided to break away and elect a rival pope. This act would go on to spark the Western Schism, a period in church history marked by two rival popes, each claiming legitimacy. which divided Christendom for decades. The French cardinals, who were still deeply aligned with the papacy's Avignon-based past, refused to accept Urban VI's papacy, accusing him of having been elected under duress and coercion. The cardinals, many of whom were from France, felt that Urban's election was invalid, and they took it upon themselves to elect a pope of their own, Clement VII. Clement VII was immediately recognized as pope in Avignon, while Urban VI's supporters remained loyal to him in Rome. This schism not only split the church, but also divided Europe along political and national lines. France, Spain, Scotland, and some of the Italian states supported Clement VII, while England and other parts of Europe remained loyal to Urban VI in Rome. Urban VI, rather than seeking reconciliation, responded to the schism with force and violence. He excommunicated Clement VII and his supporters, declaring them heretics. Urban VI's response to the Western Schism was a reflection of his inability to negotiate or compromise. Instead of seeking a peaceful resolution, he continued to employ force, fear, and intimidation, methods that had already defined much of his papacy. His inability to engage in diplomacy or accept the reality of a divided church made it impossible for him to heal the rift he had created. The schism that Urban VI's reign set into motion would persist long after his death, with the papacy split between two rival lines. The Western Schism was a major crisis for the Catholic Church, as it severely weakened its authority and credibility. The division between the two papacies led to confusion among the faithful, political maneuvering by secular rulers, and internal strife within the Church that would only be resolved decades later. Urban VI's violent actions, torture and execution of opponents. Urban VI's temper and violent actions were not only limited to his political rivals, but extended to his own clergy as well. His harsh treatment of cardinals and church officials who opposed him escalated into acts of imprisonment, torture, and even execution. One of the most chilling aspects of his reign was his use of violent punishment against those who dared to question his authority. Urban VI's response to dissent was extreme. When some of his cardinals, especially those who had initially supported him, began to question his leadership and sought to challenge his papacy, Urban resorted to extreme measures. He imprisoned some of the cardinals and subjected them to brutal interrogations, seeking to force them into submission. Reports from the time suggest that Urban VI was responsible for the execution of several of his opponents. His violent actions were not only political but personal, as he saw those who opposed him as personal enemies. Urban VI's cruelty created an atmosphere of fear within the Vatican and among the Church's highest officials. Rather than maintaining the spiritual and moral authority of the papacy, Urban VI's violent and dictatorial rule led to a complete breakdown in trust within the clergy. His failure to establish a stable diplomatic relationship with his cardinals and church officials led to widespread dissatisfaction, with many fearing for their safety under his reign. Urban VI's legacy of violence and chaos. Pope Urban VI's papacy remains one of the most violent and chaotic in church history. While his opposition to simony and his early commitment to reform are commendable, they were overshadowed by his violent temper, authoritarian rule, and the catastrophic effects of his confrontations with both political and ecclesiastical opponents. The Western Schism, which he unwittingly initiated, left a lasting division within the Church, and the political fallout from his actions weakened the papacy for years to come. Urban VI's legacy is one of missed opportunities and self-destructive behavior. His papacy serves as a reminder of the dangers of violent rule and the inability to compromise, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. His failure to reconcile with his fellow clergy, his use of force, and his violent temper ultimately led to the fracturing of the papacy, which would take centuries to heal. The chaos and division he created have left a lasting impact on the history of the Church, making Urban VI a pope remembered more for his violent and divisive actions than for any spiritual contributions. Accusations of mental instability, the political intrigue behind the claims. Pope Urban VI's papacy was marred by political intrigue, personal ambition, and deep divisions within the Church. His reign was not only marked by his intense opposition to corruption, but also by his violent and authoritarian rule, which alienated many of his allies, particularly among the cardinals. As his leadership became increasingly controversial, some of his opponents within the papacy started to spread rumors about his mental instability, with accusations that he was becoming increasingly unhinged and displaying signs of madness. However, it is crucial to note that these allegations were never conclusively proven, and many historians argue that they were part of a politically motivated smear campaign orchestrated by Urban VI's enemies, particularly the French cardinals who were disgruntled by his reforms and violent actions. Urban VI had been elected pope in 1378 under intense political pressure, at a time when the papacy was still recovering from the tumultuous years of the Avignon papacy. His early reign was focused on reforming the church and eliminating corruption, including the practice of simony, which had plagued the papacy for years. These efforts were widely seen as necessary, as they aimed to restore the church's credibility and moral authority. However, his zealous efforts to eradicate corruption and his inability to compromise with his fellow cardinals soon alienated many who had initially supported him. As Urban VI began to implement his reforms, including strict measures to curb the sale of church offices, he faced strong opposition from powerful cardinals who had benefited from the existing corrupt system. Many of the French cardinals, in particular, were deeply angered by his efforts to restrict their influence and end their lucrative dealings in the church. They began to conspire against him, claiming that his behavior was erratic and that his actions were increasingly irrational. The accusations of mental instability and violent behavior were part of a coordinated attempt to delegitimize his papacy. The primary charge against Urban VI was that he was becoming mentally unstable, with reports of erratic behavior, mood swings, and a temper that was growing uncontrollable. Some of his opponents claimed that he was showing signs of paranoia, accusing anyone who disagreed with him of plotting against him. These rumors spread quickly, and soon there were widespread claims that Urban VI was suffering from some form of mental illness. However, it is important to recognize that these claims were not based on any medical evidence or direct observations of his mental state. Instead, they were largely driven by political motivations, particularly from factions within the church who were unhappy with Urban's reforms. It is highly likely that these accusations of mental instability were part of a broader political strategy to undermine Urban VI's authority and discredit his leadership. The French cardinals, who had been particularly aggrieved by Urban's reforms, used these rumors as a tool to justify their actions. In reality, the political maneuvering behind the scenes was much more significant than any genuine concerns about the Pope's mental health. Urban's opponents saw an opportunity to exploit the situation and used the accusation of madness to rally support against him. The fact that Urban VI's political enemies were able to create such a narrative of instability reveals much about the dynamics within the church at the time. It was not just about religious differences or theological debates. It was about power and control. The cardinals who were loyal to Urban VI's reforms were fighting a battle on two fronts. One against the entrenched corruption within the church, and the other against the rising influence of secular powers who sought to control the papacy. As Urban VI's reforms threatened the established political and financial order, those who stood to lose the most were the ones who used these rumors of mental instability as a way to discredit him and secure their own positions. In fact, the claim that Urban VI was suffering from mental instability can be viewed as a strategic political move by his rivals. Given that Urban was seen as a reformist, seeking to curb corruption and improve the moral integrity of the church, it was in the best interest of those who benefited from the corrupt system to portray him as unstable. The French cardinals, who were particularly hostile to Urban, had the most to gain from undermining his papacy. They had much to lose if his reforms took hold, as many of them had been involved in practices that Urban was actively seeking to eliminate, such as the sale of ecclesiastical offices and other forms of corruption. As the opposition to Urban VI grew stronger, the rumors about his mental state were taken up by factions within the church. Some cardinals, who were disillusioned with his leadership, began to spread these rumors with greater intensity, framing them as evidence of his incapacity to lead. This political rhetoric painted Urban VI as a man unfit for the papacy, even though there was little concrete evidence to support the claim of mental illness. In this light, the accusation of mental instability must be understood not as a genuine concern, but as a political weapon used by those who sought to bring down the Pope. The accusations of mental instability were also likely fueled by Urban's violent temper and authoritarian style of leadership. Urban VI was known for his outbursts of rage, especially when his authority was questioned. His violent reactions to criticism, particularly from the cardinals, further fed the narrative of a pope who was unable to control his emotions and who ruled through fear. While his behavior was undoubtedly harsh and authoritarian, it is important to recognize that his actions were not necessarily indicative of mental illness, but rather of a man struggling to maintain control in a period of intense political and religious tension. The political motivation behind the allegations. The key to understanding the allegations against Urban VI lies in the political context of his papacy. Urban was not only dealing with internal corruption within the church, but also with the growing influence of secular rulers, such as King Philip IV of France, who were determined to exert their control over the papacy. Urban's strong stance against simony and his refusal to bow to political pressure made him a polarizing figure, and it was no surprise that those who opposed him would resort to whatever means necessary to remove him from power. The rumors of mental instability were an effective weapon for Urban's enemies. By framing him as unfit to rule, they were able to undermine his authority and challenge his legitimacy. This move was a direct response to his efforts to bring reform to the church and curb the influence of corrupt clergy. The accusations, then, were not based on Urban's actual mental health, but were part of a broader effort to discredit his papacy and restore the status quo. Urban VI's papacy illustrates the power struggles and political maneuvering that shaped the medieval church. The accusations of mental instability were not only a reflection of his volatile leadership, but also a tactical move by his rivals to gain power. As Urban's reforms threatened the entrenched corruption and political interests of certain factions, these groups turned to rumors and slander to discredit him and turn public opinion against him. The use of mental illness as a weapon in this political battle speaks to the lengths to which rivals would go to protect their own interests. While accusations of mental instability were levied against Pope Urban VI, it is essential to view these claims through a political lens. Urban's violent temperament and harsh leadership style may have contributed to the narrative of instability, but the real force behind these allegations was political rivalry. The French cardinals, who opposed Urban's reforms and saw their power threatened, used the rumors of mental illness to undermine his authority and legitimize their actions. Urban VI's papacy, while marked by authoritarianism and conflict, also exposes the deep political machinations within the church, as factions competed not only for spiritual authority, but for secular control. The allegations against Urban VI were not a reflection of genuine concern about his mental health, but a strategic attempt to bring down a pope whose reforms threatened the status quo. Accusations of mental instability. The political campaign against Urban VI. The claim that Pope Urban VI was mentally unstable and showing signs of madness is one of the most significant accusations leveled against him. But it is crucial to approach these allegations with caution. While Urban VI's papacy was marked by violent outbursts, authoritarianism, and political conflicts, it is highly debatable whether these behaviors can be attributed to genuine mental illness, or if they were instead the result of calculated political moves by his opponents within the church. The charges of mental instability were raised by a faction of cardinals who had become increasingly disillusioned with Urban VI's leadership, and there are compelling reasons to believe that these accusations were less about psychological health and more about political maneuvering. Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Prignano, was a pope who initially gained respect for his zealous commitment to reform and his opposition to simony, a practice of selling church offices that had long plagued the institution. His efforts to root out corruption within the clergy and enforce stricter rules on church governance earned him the support of some, but his forceful methods soon alienated others, particularly within the ranks of the cardinals. As his reign progressed, Urban VI's leadership became increasingly authoritarian, marked by a fiery temper and violent reactions toward those who questioned his authority. These traits were often seen as signs of a man determined to restore order and implement reforms, but they also made him a deeply polarizing figure within the church. While Urban VI's behavior was certainly erratic at times, particularly in his dealings with the cardinals who opposed him, it is important to recognize that the accusations of mental instability came from those very same factions that were dissatisfied with his rule. These cardinals were primarily from France, and their political and personal interests were directly threatened by Urban's crackdown on corruption and his defiance of the growing secular influence over the papacy. It's essential to consider that these accusations might have been strategically motivated by Urban VI's political rivals, who had much to lose if his reforms succeeded. The very nature of these allegations, the timing and the individuals who raised them, suggests that they could have been a deliberate attempt to discredit him, rather than a reflection of his true mental state. At the time of Urban VI's election in 1378, the papacy was already deeply divided, and his assertive stance against corruption had put him in direct conflict with a group of cardinals who had benefited from the previous system. Many of these cardinals had engaged in the very practices that Urban sought to eliminate, and they saw him as a threat to their positions of power. When Urban VI began to take strong measures to reform the church, including purging corrupt officials and enacting strict policies against simony, many of his detractors felt their livelihoods were at risk. In response, they launched a political campaign against him, accusing him of mental instability and painting him as an unfit ruler. The claim that Urban VI exhibited signs of madness, including mood swings and irrational behavior, needs to be treated with skepticism. While it is true that he displayed a fiery temper and was known for his violent reactions to perceived disloyalty, these traits were not unusual for a man who was embroiled in fierce political battles and had an intense desire to assert papal authority. His confrontational style was often driven by a determination to restore the power of the papacy in the face of both internal and external challenges. In this context, his aggressive behavior might have been a reflection of his frustration with the political factions within the church, rather than a clear sign of mental illness. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the allegations of mental instability were based largely on rumors and second-hand accounts. There was no formal diagnosis or medical evidence presented to substantiate these claims. The cardinals who were critical of Urban VI had no genuine way to assess his mental health. They simply used the accusation of madness as a weapon to undermine his credibility and legitimacy. The fact that they resorted to such extreme accusations raises important questions about their motivations. Were they genuinely concerned about Urban's mental health, or were they more interested in removing him from power by any means necessary? The political context behind the mental instability allegations. The political context surrounding the accusations of mental instability is crucial for understanding the motives behind them. Urban VI was at odds with powerful factions within the church, and these factions had much to lose if his reforms succeeded. His efforts to root out corruption, end the sale of church offices, and curb the influence of secular rulers in papal affairs threatened the status quo, which had benefited many cardinals and other church officials. Urban's direct approach to reform, combined with his volatile personality, alienated large portions of the church hierarchy. His confrontational style put him at odds with those who had become accustomed to the more indulgent and less accountable papacy of previous years. The French cardinals, who were particularly opposed to Urban VI, had a significant role in fueling the narrative of his mental instability. These cardinals were the primary beneficiaries of the previous papacy's laxity, and Urban's strict policies posed a direct challenge to their influence. When Urban VI began to implement his reforms, the French cardinals saw their power slipping away and took the opportunity to turn against him. They accused him of mental illness not only as a political tactic, but also as a way to justify their decision to elect a rival pope, Clement VII, in 1378, just months after Urban's election. By framing Urban as unstable and unfit to lead, they sought to legitimize their own actions and to rally support for the opposing papacy they had created. The fact that these accusations were so widely spread, particularly by Urban's enemies within the church, suggests that they were not made out of genuine concern for his well-being, but were instead part of a calculated campaign to remove him from power. It is important to consider that during this period, the papacy was deeply entangled in political rivalries, and such accusations could be used as a tool to weaken an opponent's position. Urban VI's opponents knew that if they could paint him as mentally unstable, they could potentially delegitimize his papacy and rally support for their own cause. The use of mental illness as a political tool. Throughout history, accusations of mental instability have often been used as a political tool to undermine the legitimacy of a leader or ruler. In the case of Urban VI, the claim that he was mentally unfit to govern served as a powerful weapon in the hands of his opponents. By portraying him as irrational and unpredictable, they sought to strip him of the moral authority that was essential to his role as pope. This strategy was not unique to Urban VI. It has been employed against other political figures throughout history, particularly in situations where rivals seek to discredit a leader's rule. The use of mental illness accusations in Urban VI's case raises important questions about the ethics of political maneuvering in the medieval church. While it is possible that Urban VI exhibited signs of stress, frustration, and anger, emotions that are often seen in leaders under pressure. There is no evidence to suggest that he was suffering from any genuine mental illness. The intense political pressures of his reign, combined with his forceful leadership style, may have led to his erratic behavior, but these actions do not necessarily point to mental instability. Instead, they reflect the immense challenges he faced as he tried to implement his reforms in the face of widespread opposition. In conclusion, the allegations of mental instability against Pope Urban VI should be viewed with skepticism. While his temper and forceful leadership style undoubtedly made him a polarizing figure, the accusations of madness were likely politically motivated and aimed at undermining his authority. The cardinals who opposed him were more interested in removing him from power than in genuinely addressing his mental health. These allegations, fueled by political rivalry and personal ambition, ultimately serve as a reminder of the lengths to which individuals will go to achieve their goals, even when it involves discrediting a leader through unfounded claims. Chapter 6: Pope Alexander VI, Family Power and Sin. Corruption and Extreme Nepotism. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia in 1431, is often remembered as one of the most corrupt and controversial popes in the history of the Catholic Church. His papacy, which lasted from 1492 until his death in 1503, was marked by extreme nepotism, political manipulation, and moral decay. While he did not lack political acumen or administrative ability, his reign is synonymous with scandal and the degradation of the papal office. One of the most striking features of Alexander VI's papacy was his blatant nepotism. As pope, he used his position to secure power and wealth for his family, the Borgias, through strategic appointments and the creation of vast political alliances. Alexander's actions often contradicted the very moral teachings of the Church, and his accumulation of wealth and power at the expense of ecclesiastical values contributed to the widespread corruption that plagued the papacy during this period. The most egregious example of his nepotism was his appointment of his children to high positions within the Church. Perhaps most famously, his son Cesare Borgia, who had been born out of wedlock to Alexander's mistress Venazia Catanii, was made a cardinal at the age of 17, a position he held despite being entirely unqualified for the role. Cesare's appointment was not based on merit, but on his father's desire to consolidate power for the Borgia family. This was a clear violation of the Church's doctrine, which stated that ecclesiastical positions should be awarded to those of high moral character and spiritual devotion, not to those who could offer the Pope political advantages. But it didn't stop there. Alexander also arranged advantageous marriages and political alliances for his children, further strengthening his family's grip on power. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, was married off multiple times to powerful men in Italy to further the Borgia family's political goals. Her marriages, particularly to the powerful rulers of Ferrara and later to the Duke of Urbino, were orchestrated to ensure the Borgias maintained influence in Italy's fragmented political landscape. The level of Alexander's nepotism reached its peak when, in addition to appointing his children to the most important positions within the Church, he also gave them vast estates, wealth, and power, using the papacy as a tool for his family's benefit. His close relatives were given control over vast swaths of land, while his children were able to amass personal fortunes that were not only a reflection of the Pope's disregard for Church teachings, but also a sign of the growing entanglement of Church and secular power. While many popes had relatives and loyal supporters whom they rewarded with titles and positions, Alexander VI's nepotism was on a scale that shocked both contemporaries and later historians. His actions demonstrated a complete disregard for the ideals of celibacy and spiritual purity that were supposed to characterize the papacy and instead reflected the political pragmatism of the time. The Borgia family's growing power in Italy also led to accusations of corruption, violence, and moral decay. The papacy of Alexander VI stands in stark contrast to the image of the Pope as a servant of Christ and the Church. His reign marks a period in which the Church's spiritual and moral authority was severely compromised by the greed and political ambitions of its leaders. Alexander VI's use of the papacy as a vehicle for his family's personal gain only contributed to the growing sense of disillusionment with the Church, which was becoming increasingly entangled in the secular power struggles of Italy and Europe. However, it is important to note that Alexander VI's nepotism was not merely a matter of family loyalty. It was also a reflection of the larger political dynamics of the time. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were marked by intense political competition between powerful Italian families, and the papacy itself was often caught in the crossfire of these struggles. Alexander VI's actions must be understood in this context, where the ability to maintain political power often took precedence over spiritual concerns. The rise of the Borgia family during Alexander VI's papacy, and the way in which he leveraged the papacy to strengthen his family's political position, remains one of the most enduring examples of corruption in church history. Alexander VI's reign, defined by nepotism and the exploitation of his position for personal gain, would leave a lasting stain on the papacy, contributing to the growing criticisms of the Church that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. In many ways, Alexander VI's reign serves as a symbol of the moral decay and political entanglements that defined the papacy in the late Middle Ages. His ruthless pursuit of power for his family undermined the Church's moral authority and exposed the ways in which ecclesiastical positions had become entangled with secular politics, wealth, and influence. Public affairs and scandalous affairs. Pope Alexander VI's papacy is notorious not only for its extreme nepotism, but also for the many public scandals that marked his personal life. As one of the most controversial popes in history, Alexander VI's numerous affairs, political manipulations, and familial alliances have overshadowed his papacy, turning it into one of the most decadent periods in the Church's history. His reputation as a pope driven by personal desires and ambitions rather than spiritual devotion led to widespread disillusionment and scandal. Alexander VI's personal relationships were often the subject of gossip and outrage. His most famous affair was with Venazia Catanii, a Roman noblewoman, with whom he had several children, including Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. While these relationships were not uncommon among popes during this era, Alexander VI's blatant disregard for the vow of celibacy was seen as a striking contradiction to his role as the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. This disregard for the Church's teachings on sexual morality, combined with his many affairs, painted a picture of a man who viewed the papacy not as a position of religious service, but as a tool for personal and political gain. However, Alexander VI's affairs went beyond mere relationships. They were intricately tied to his ambitions for his family's rise to power. His relationships with women, particularly those of noble and influential families, were strategic, designed to strengthen the Borgia family's position within the complex political landscape of Renaissance Italy. His relationship with Giulia Farnese, another powerful Roman noblewoman, further exemplified this dynamic. Giulia, often described as a stunning beauty, was both a mistress and a close political ally. The Farnese family, as a result of this connection, gained significant influence in the Vatican, with members of the Farnese family receiving powerful positions within the Church. Despite the moral and ethical contradictions inherent in these affairs, Alexander VI's actions were also highly politically motivated. His papacy marked a time when the papacy itself had become increasingly intertwined with the secular politics of Italy, where powerful families competed for influence and control. The rise of the Borgia family was not solely the result of Alexander's charisma or piety, but also due to his shrewd political alliances through his personal relationships. Alexander's relationships were both a reflection of the power struggles within Italy and a tool used by him to consolidate his family's grip on both the church and secular politics. One of the most notorious aspects of Alexander VI's papacy was the way in which his personal life directly impacted his political decisions and the appointments he made within the church. By promoting his family members to key ecclesiastical positions, Alexander was not just advancing his family's interests. He was also using the church to solidify his political power. For example, he made his son Cesare Borgia a cardinal, despite Cesare being far too young and unqualified for such an office. Cesare's appointment was more about securing power for the Borgia family than about spiritual or theological qualifications. Similarly, Alexander arranged marriages for his daughter Lucrezia, using these alliances to strengthen the political reach of the Borgia family. Beyond his family, Alexander VI's relationships also extended to powerful Italian figures, such as the influential rulers of the time. He used his position to broker deals and form alliances with various political players, further complicating the relationship between church and state. For instance, Alexander VI's relationships with figures like the King of Naples and the rulers of various Italian city-states demonstrated how the papacy had become not just a spiritual office, but also a tool of political negotiation. The lines between the sacred and the secular had blurred under his reign, with the papacy no longer serving as a purely spiritual leader, but as a central player in the power struggles of Renaissance Italy. Yet, despite the political successes and power Alexander VI gained through his relationships, his personal life was scandalous and at times violent. The notorious rumors about the Borgia family's decadence only intensified during Alexander's papacy. His children, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia, became the subject of many rumors, and their personal lives were intertwined with the political machinations of their father. The public perception of the Borgias was one of excessive indulgence and treachery. Lucrezia Borgia, in particular, became a symbol of the Borgia family's scandalous reputation. While there is evidence to suggest that many of the rumors surrounding her, including accusations of incest and poisoning, were exaggerated or entirely fabricated, her name became synonymous with the corruption and immorality that defined her father's papacy. While Alexander VI's political machinations may have been the driving force behind these rumors, they nevertheless served to tarnish the reputation of the church and its leader. The legacy of Alexander VI's sexual indiscretions and political manipulations is deeply intertwined with the broader history of Renaissance Italy and the Catholic Church. The papacy, once the spiritual heart of Europe, had become an institution marked by nepotism, corruption, and personal ambition. Alexander VI's papacy served as a stark reminder of how power, wealth, and influence could be used to bend the sacred institution of the Church to the will of those who sought it. While many popes before and after Alexander VI had personal relationships or lived in ways contrary to Church teachings, few did so with such blatant disregard for the sanctity of the papacy. His open affairs, particularly with women of high status, combined with his use of his children and family as pawns in his political games, left a legacy that would haunt the Church for centuries. Even after his death, the reputation of the Borgia family continued to be a source of scandal, contributing to a long-lasting perception of corruption within the Vatican. The moral consequences of Alexander VI's papacy. The papacy of Alexander VI was not only marked by his personal affairs, but also by the moral consequences these affairs had on the Church. The Church, as the leading institution of spiritual and moral guidance in Europe, had been deeply affected by the corruption that festered within its walls during Alexander VI's reign. By using his position to benefit his family and promote his political interests, Alexander VI set a dangerous precedent for future popes. The lines between politics and religion were permanently blurred, and the moral authority of the papacy suffered as a result. The public nature of Alexander VI's personal life made it impossible for the Church to distance itself from the corruption that he embodied. Unlike previous popes who might have kept their personal lives private, Alexander VI's relationships were well known and widely discussed. This scandalous exposure of the papacy's internal corruption contributed to the growing disillusionment with the Church, especially as the Reformation movement began to gain momentum in the 16th century. The Banquet of Chestnuts, 1501. One of the most infamous events during Pope Alexander VI's papacy was the notorious Banquet of Chestnuts in 1501. This lavish and scandalous event has become emblematic of the extreme moral decay and excesses associated with his papacy. While the precise details of the banquet are shrouded in rumor and uncertainty, it is widely accepted that it was a sexually charged, debauched gathering that demonstrated the Pope's complete disregard for the sanctity of his office and the moral teachings of the Church. The Banquet of Chestnuts reportedly took place in the Vatican and was organized by the Pope's son, Cesare Borgia, who was deeply involved in the political and military strategies of the time. Cesare, who had been appointed a cardinal by his father at a young age, was known for his ruthlessness and ambition. The banquet, by all accounts, was attended by members of the Borgia family, influential figures in the church, and high-ranking courtiers, many of whom were involved in a series of sexual escapades, with both men and women participating. The name Banquet of Chestnuts is believed to be derived from the chestnuts that were served as part of the meal, which were said to be used as part of the sexual games that took place during the event. While much of the history surrounding the event is obscured by time and myth, contemporary accounts suggest that the Banquet of Chestnuts was a deliberate display of power and decadence. It is said that the Pope himself either participated in or at least condoned the event, which involved prostitutes, promiscuous behavior, and a general atmosphere of indulgence. The scandal was so great that rumors of the event spread across Europe, severely tarnishing the image of the papacy. The Borgia family, already notorious for their corrupt and immoral behavior, became synonymous with vice, indulgence, and moral corruption. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of the broader pattern of behavior exhibited by Pope Alexander VI and his family. His use of the papacy as a vehicle for personal and family gain, combined with the sexual excesses and political machinations of the Borgias, created an environment of moral and spiritual decay. The event further cemented the perception that the papacy had become an institution controlled by secular power and greed, rather than by the spiritual guidance and moral authority that it was supposed to represent. While the Banquet of Chestnuts is one of the most notorious examples of Borgia excess, it also highlights the larger issue of the papacy's moral decline during Alexander VI's reign. The event is often cited as a symbol of the corrupt and depraved state of the Church during the late 15th century, a time when the papacy was entangled in politics, power struggles, and personal indulgence. Alexander VI's papacy, and events like the Banquet of Chestnuts, underscored the growing divide between the sacred nature of the papacy and the secular, political ambitions that dominated it. Conspiracy and assassinations. In addition to the scandalous banquets and personal excesses, Alexander VI's papacy was also marked by numerous political conspiracies and even outright assassinations. One of the most notorious events during his reign was the murder of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici in 1494. Although the exact circumstances surrounding his death are unclear, it is widely believed that the Borgia family had a hand in orchestrating his assassination in order to eliminate a powerful rival. Cesare Borgia, Alexander VI's son, was often directly involved in the execution of such political eliminations. Cesare, who had been groomed for a career in the church but later pursued a military path, was infamous for his violent and unscrupulous methods. He used his influence to manipulate both religious and political figures, ensuring that his family's interests were protected. Cesare's rise to power was not the result of merit or divine favor, but rather through the manipulation of his father, Pope Alexander VI, who ensured that his son held crucial positions within the church and its governance. The Borgia family's penchant for violence and assassination was not limited to enemies of the family. Even members of the family were not immune to suspicion and intrigue. The most infamous example of Borgia internal politics was the relationship between Alexander VI's daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, and her various marriages. Lucrezia's marriages were largely political, meant to forge alliances between the Borgia family and powerful families in Italy. However, there are persistent rumors suggesting that some of her husbands may have been murdered to further the political ambitions of the Borgia family. While there is no conclusive evidence to support these claims, the constant rumors and suspicions about the Borgias' involvement in such events added to the family's dark reputation. The use of violence as a political tool under Alexander VI's reign was part of a larger pattern of corruption within the papacy. The church, which had once been seen as a spiritual institution, was now used as a political tool to gain and maintain power. The papacy, once a symbol of moral and spiritual leadership, had become deeply entangled in the complex politics of Italy and Europe. For Alexander VI, the papacy was a means to an end, an institution to be exploited for the benefit of his family and his political ambitions. The Borgia legacy, corruption and power, the Banquet of Chestnuts, and the political violence of Alexander VI's reign are just two examples of the broader legacy of corruption and excess that came to define the Borgia family. Alexander VI used his position as pope not to lead the church, but to secure political power and wealth for himself and his family. His reign was marked by nepotism, conspiracy, and moral compromise. The Borgias' political manipulations and indulgences led to a breakdown in the spiritual authority of the papacy and undermined the church's moral credibility. The Borgia family's legacy would continue to haunt the church for centuries. The scandals, murders, and conspiracies that occurred during Alexander VI's papacy set the stage for the Reformation and the growing disillusionment with the Catholic Church. The papacy's entanglement in political intrigue and personal ambition made it impossible for the church to maintain its spiritual authority, and the moral decay associated with the Borgia family served as a catalyst for the calls for reform that would eventually reshape Christianity. Pope Alexander VI's papacy is remembered as a time of great excess, corruption, and moral decay. The banquet of chestnuts, his violent political maneuverings, and his blatant nepotism were all emblematic of the Borgia family's stranglehold on the papacy. While Alexander VI's actions may have strengthened the political position of the Borgia family, they also marked the beginning of the end for the papacy's influence as a spiritual leader of Christendom. His papacy, filled with scandal and debauchery, left a lasting stain on the church, and his legacy remains one of the most controversial in the history of the papacy. Conclusion. The legacies of the 6 popes featured today: Pope Stephen VI, Pope John XII, Pope Benedict IX, Pope Boniface VIII, Pope Urban VI, and Pope Alexander VI, are a complex mixture of truth, rumor, and political intrigue. These figures, often seen as embodiments of moral authority, were also embroiled in scandals that ranged from violent power struggles to personal debauchery. Some of these events, like the infamous Cadaver Synod or the Banquet of Chestnuts, have been recorded as historical facts, but their accuracy is often disputed. Were they the result of real actions, or were they exaggerated or fabricated in the highly charged atmosphere of medieval political games? In the grand scheme, faith remains a noble and pure pursuit, an unwavering foundation for millions. But as we examine these papal figures, we are reminded that even those entrusted with divine authority are human. Their flaws, their sins, their ambitions, they are reminders that power, when unchecked, can corrupt. Whether these tales are true or merely rumors, one thing is clear. Faith endures, but the imperfection of humanity often clouds its highest office. The history of these popes serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of mixing religion with the pursuit of worldly power. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products.